It wasn't the first that tried to create a living, breathing 3D sandbox, but Grand Theft Auto 3 was the first masterpiece of the open world genre, spawning a series of spectacular sequels and an army of ardent imitators. Its publisher, Rockstar Games, had lived up to their namesake, an overnight sensation with a bright and lucrative future. But what if I told you this wasn't their first foray into open world design? In 1998, Rockstar North, then known as DMA Design, released Body Harvest, a Nintendo 64 exclusive with ambitious free roam design, vehicular mayhem, and third-person gunplay. Sound familiar? From spilling blood on Shigeru Miyamoto himself to half of the developers leaving the team in one day, the making of Body Harvest had never a dull moment, and to mark the game's 20th anniversary, I spoke with several ex-DMA developers who worked on Body Harvest to find out the real story behind this Grand Theft Granddaddy. DMA Design was first formed in 1987 by four friends in Dundee, Scotland. But you might be thinking, wait, how did DMA Design become Rockstar North? Well, let's get that history lesson out of the way first. So, in September 1999, American publisher Take-Two Interactive bought DMA Design off French publisher Infogrames, later renaming the studio Rockstar North in 2002. Okay, back to Body Harvest. So, by the mid-90s, DMA had started to gain popularity thanks to early hits like Menace and Lemmings. The studio had grown to be so successful by the mid-90s that Nintendo commissioned DMA for 3 exclusive titles, becoming part of the so-called Nintendo Dream Team, a wave of third-party developers brought on to make games for Nintendo's upcoming 64-bit home console, then codenamed the Ultra 64. These 3 games would become Body Harvest, Space Station Silicon Valley, and Zenith. Steve Hammond was one of DMA's founding members and a writer for Body Harvest in its early development. He was also heavily involved in the original pitch that led to the game being greenlit by Nintendo.
When the project began, Nintendo was not cool. Sega was cool. Sega had Sonic the Hedgehog, they were cool. They appealed to the teens, dynamic, energetic. So Nintendo now had the Play It Loud, campaign, where they tried to, get some of that cred, basically. So Play It Loud, a big, violent, over-the-top action game, which is what Body Harvest was going to be. And the Play It Loud campaign, that had been and gone by the time Body Harvest actually went out there. So it didn't really meet the... Well, we were all chasing a moving target, really. I mean, this document is original spec from Design Meeting, and it's dated 17th of November 94. That's all I have to go on. Okay, let's find the synopsis. What is this document? The background. But in brief, it says, it is the future. Not too many years from now, brackets, so we can use modern weapons. The 50s have returned with a vengeance. Rock and roll, Cadillacs and hot rods. Drive-in, virtual movies, and a weird killer robot spiders roam the land. So, Body Harvest is a 1950s B-movie type of game. Classics like Them, Invaders from Mars, The Blob, and Tremors are a good reference. So this is the earliest, that I've got access to.
By the time Body Harvest released, the concept that was pitched would experience a lot of changes. Instead of a 1950s B-movie, you would instead take part in a time-travelling sci-fi adventure, fending off a legion of enormous bugs who beam down to Earth to harvest humans as a source of food. Each level would take place in a different time period: 1916 Greece, 1941 Java, North America in 1966, and 1991 Siberia, culminating in a full-on assault on the bugs' home base in the far-flung future of 2016. In a comedically rigid opening cutscene, we're introduced to a voiceless protagonist, Adam Drake, who, according to the game's manual, is basically humanity's last hope. Bugs attack the station, and Adam quickly escapes through a time machine, setting off to prevent the genocide of humanity at the hands of their insect invaders. When you first touch down in 1916 Greece, you're thrown into an expansive player sandbox with diverging paths, tons of different vehicles, and plenty of bugs to keep you company. This was DMA's first fully 3D endeavour, yet even in its early stages, Body Harvest was always intended to have large, open environments. For the mid-90s, this was incredibly ambitious, given at the time even pseudo-3D games were still finding their feet in linear corridors, let alone open worlds. Richard Ralph was a designer on Body Harvest, and was heavily involved in crafting the game's progressive open world.
I think the 3D was definitely a hurdle that everybody tried to overcome, but the fact that it was open world at the same time was, you're basically compounding the issue. Because approaching an open world game, you are basically saying, we don't want barriers. We don't want barriers to anything, and you're trying to minimise as many barriers as possible. The fact that that was kind of thrown into a 3D environment at the time when nobody really knew how to build a 3D game properly, and there was very little out there to reference, we really just had to try and figure it out. Even simple things like the camera behaviour, there was no real reference as to how that should work. There were definitely huge challenges, and I think we probably made it harder for ourselves because of the type of game we were trying to make.
With that said, Richard, what was the biggest design pitfall that the team fell into?
The biggest one I encountered was simply directing the player. When it's very difficult to funnel the player or to set up barriers to funnel them. And on one hand, you're saying to the player, oh, look at all this stuff, you can go anywhere, you can do whatever you like. But on the other hand, you're trying to create missions and objectives and real conflicts with the alien invaders that they can't possibly avoid. Those two things are kind of opposite. We came up with other simple mechanisms that I guess are pretty commonplace now, like waypoints, like a much more detailed map than we originally tried to produce. We obviously wrote a lot of dialogue, a lot of signs, a lot of direction, and obviously all of that helped. But sculpting the landscape was effectively what it ended up resorting to. You basically created a lot of waterways, a lot of bridges, a lot of roads to try and lead the player, even though they could just go off-road anytime they wanted. Finding that balance between being able to explore the environment that you've created, use the tools that you've put in front of them, but also make sure that they hit their objectives and don't miss out on anything is tricky. But I wouldn't describe it as scary. It's just, it's just a process you kind of have to nail. And I think we did. In the game, we got it better in some places than others. We didn't really have what I would consider these days to be a solid design process. There was a goal and an ambition and a number of changes that happened around the game and around the company that kind of forced us down a certain path. Everything I've learned after that point in terms of good design and good design processes kind of came out of learnings of what didn't really work on Body Harvest.
For about 2 years, the team tinkered away in relative isolation from Nintendo's input. So far removed was DMA from Nintendo that the team didn't even know the specs of the N64 until the game was almost done. This led to a conservative, low-polygon graphical style that caused Body Harvest to look noticeably outdated when stacked up against its contemporaries. Up until this point, the design was also pretty basic, resembling a straightforward arcade game, which Nintendo ultimately decided was too simple. This forced Nintendo to eventually become more involved in the development of Body Harvest. They insisted that DMA visit their headquarters in Kyoto to re-evaluate the project and make some overdue changes to the game's design. 4 DMA developers made the visit to Japan in February 1997, one of which was designer Richard Ralph.
We didn't really know what we were going for, to be honest, other than to kind of bring them up to speed as to where the project was, what we thought should be done with it, which was not fully fleshed out. And it became quite clear, pretty much straight away, that they were very willing to collaborate on finding a way forward for the project, which was great. I mean, we initially planned to go out there for I think 6 or 7 days, have a few design meetings, get a bit clearer on what the future of it would be. But we ended up staying quite a bit longer. I think we were there for 12 days in total. And yeah, we were basically locked in a room with a bunch of their EAD design guys and an interpreter, obviously. And we just threw ideas around, really. We created a bunch of new content that would support the adventure missions, created some puzzles. It was 10, 12 hours a day for 10 days, trying to figure out how the first level would work and see if that opened up the rest of the game, if that makes sense. And whilst it was very intensive, it was a hell of a lot of fun. They took us through the general process that they used. They actually took us through, so Star Fox 64 was still in development at that time. They took us into that design room, showed us their plan for it, which was all up on the wall in post-it notes, and took us through how they had gone about designing Star Fox. You know, to some extent it was relevant in terms of the general process they used, but obviously that was a sequel. They obviously had a lot of content that they were refreshing for that game. It did really help us understand them, if that makes sense.
Stacey Jameson was the lead artist on Body Harvest. He made the trip to Kyoto as well, and when I spoke earlier with writer Steve Hammond, he said that when I interview Stacey, I must ask him about the time he spilt a pint on Nintendo legend Shigeru Miyamoto. This was his side of the story.
So what it was is they kept taking us out for traditional Japanese meals. I still remember I was terrified for every meal that we would actually go out with those guys, because they kept taking us to these really, really nice Japanese restaurants. But we'd all led very sheltered lives in Scotland. So a lot of this food was just like crazy to us. So we went out there for a traditional meal, and Shigeru Miyamoto, he was sitting directly in front of me at the time. So they ordered lots of food, and it was just normal small talk as well. And then the food came, and it was a small bowl of beef, but it was raw beef in sort of like some blood. So it was just sitting in front of me. And, I'd never used chopsticks before in my life. So I was picking this up, and I was like trying my best to be very graceful with this piece of beef. And to my horror, this beef just slipped out of the chopsticks, landed in the bowl of blood. And, oh my god, this little bit of blood just flew straight across the other side of the table. I don't want to say that it hit him, but yeah, it hit him. So I was horrified by this, but he was like super polite, and he gave me face and everything like that. But I was horrified that I splashed him with blood. And then about 20 seconds later, a beer came across and got put directly in front of me. So I was like, oh, thank you. And I was like thanking Shigeru for like getting me this beer, so I drank the beer and that. And then all of a sudden I saw him ordering another beer, so it was like, oh, I'd realized I'd not only splashed him with blood, but I also stole his beer. So it was probably the most traumatizing moment of my life.
By all accounts, DMA's trip to Kyoto was intense, for different reasons, but it wasn't without tangible takeaways. The game's simple action structure was to be built upon, with the addition of light RPG mechanics and a stronger focus on adventure-style gameplay.
The big takeaway was that we understood much better what they meant by an adventure light RPG, effectively, because that wasn't clear. And some of the conversations that we'd had prior to that meeting, which were obviously done at a distance, some of it had got lost in translation.
When we came back, it was really daunting what lay ahead of us. I mean, we had a lot of design meetings and that with Shigeru, with the guys over at Nintendo. So we had like a pretty good idea of what they actually wanted, but we really had to try and fit this in before the launch of Body Harvest, and before the launch of the N64 as well. So we had like a huge mammoth task ahead of us.
Body Harvest would eventually grow to resemble Nintendo's vision. Players could now enter buildings, talk with NPCs, and levels were now broken up with short quests that often required items or the completion of puzzles that gradually gained players access to more of the map. Unfortunately, successfully taking on Nintendo's feedback would not be enough to satisfy the company. The Nintendo 64 had now been on the market for over a year, and time had run out. Not long after returning from Kyoto, Nintendo cancelled its publishing deal with DMA. Very soon after, DMA was bought by British publisher Gremlin Interactive, who took on the publishing rights for Body Harvest in Europe, while Midway would handle the North American release.
Towards the end, it was really tough when they were trying to shoehorn all of the RPG elements in, stuff that we were actually really against as a studio. We were like, how can they do this? How can we sort of like work in this way? And then later on, when we were actually dropped by Nintendo to be a first party developer, and then we were picked up by Midway Games, towards the end, I think morale really took a hit on this project. It definitely was a bit of a turbulent time during DMA's history in that. You know, we were riding on the crest of the wave after like GTA. We were always expected to be the next big thing that DMA were actually going to be coming out. But then, you know, with all the troubles that we had in development, the change of publisher, the change of direction for the game, it really did hit morale.
Despite being dropped by Nintendo, the good news was DMA still had a game that was basically complete, save some crucial months for polishing the product. At this point, DMA's new owner, Gremlin Interactive, sent Jim Woods to act as general manager on the project to get Body Harvest over the finish line and released as soon as possible.
So the key thing for me when I went to DMA was all about delivering product. That's what I was taken there to do. I was quite surprised when I got there. There was not so much enthusiasm in the team for the product, partly because I think of the journey they'd been on with Nintendo. So I was obviously recruited by Gremlin and asked to go up and help out at DMA. It was, ironically, within 4 weeks of me arriving, I think roughly about 50% of the Body Harvest team actually left the company. I don't think it was directly related to me joining. I think it was more an indication of their frustration and the way the product was going. But I do remember that was one of the first big issues that we had to deal with. Was I think there was between 8 and 10 people actually left the business directly from the Body Harvest team, and we had to then try and fill those gaps, recruit new people, move people from other parts of the business to try and finish the product off. Well, obviously they took with them a lot of knowledge and experience and understanding of what it was Nintendo was trying to do, and also the journey that the product had been on, which is not good at any point. But it was difficult. There were a couple of really good stalwarts there. John White, obviously the lead programmer at the time, he was absolutely key to us actually getting the product finished in the end. But it did mean that we had to make some harsh decisions in terms of further changes that Nintendo were requesting, and we just basically had to say, you know, we're going to take the product as it is now and try and complete it. No more changes. We've got to go with what we've got. And that's what we did to the best of our ability.
When Nintendo dropped Body Harvest, so too did it void the previous deal that would have seen 3 titles developed for the N64. The other 2 I mentioned earlier, Space Station Silicon Valley and Zenith. Space Station did eventually release in October 1998 under a new publisher, Take-Two Interactive. But what about Zenith? Sadly, Zenith was cancelled. Through all of my interviews and research though, I still can't find out when. What I do know is that Zenith was initially put on hold to focus energy on Body Harvest and Space Station, but was cancelled soon after. As a result, many of Zenith's developers transitioned straight onto Body Harvest. Artist Paul Reeves was one of those developers. He left DMA not long after joining the Body Harvest team, so I started our conversation by asking him to explain what kind of game Zenith was.
It was a futuristic sport of characters racing to the top up this tower. They raced against each other, they would fight against each other, and they'd fight against obstacles. So a vertical racing game. I mean, it was like one day we were on Zenith, the next day we were on Body Harvest, literally within a day. I mean, all the tools we were using were exactly the same, you know, still at the same workstation, still in the same room, still working beside the same guys. It's just like the stuff that we're producing was different. I mean, a lot of changes did happen, and the feelings were kind of mixed about Gremlin coming on board. All of a sudden, there was these people who I'd never seen before were milling around, and there's one time that this chap who I'd never seen before, dressed in a suit, just sort of stuck his head over my shoulder. Yeah, and he was just looking over and says, "Yeah, those textures could use a bit more purple in them." And then he buggered off. And then later on, the same chap walking around looks over my shoulder. I don't think I've ever seen yellow rocks before, and it was just like, who are you? It's like, I'm making stuff that's on an alien planet here, and regardless of the fact there are yellow rocks on Earth anyway. I mean, who are you? I still don't know what his job title was meant to be. I think his job title was to annoy people. It was a real mystery, There seemed to be too many cooks, too many people pulling things in too many different directions, not really getting a chance to do our best work anymore. I mean, I hate making excuses for things, but it was becoming quite frustrating towards the end, and it got to a point where I was just so thoroughly disheartened by it, and on top of everything else, I just I want to move on now.
On September 30th, 1998, Body Harvest finally hit store shelves. The team that started the project was a very different composition to that which ended it, and despite being dropped by gaming's biggest name, the team had endured and delivered an incredibly ambitious title, taking the first painful step into large three-dimensional open worlds. Ambition, however, did not equal sales. Despite enjoying solid reviews, Body Harvest was a commercial failure, in no thanks to the game's minuscule marketing budget.
Gremlin had obviously made a lot of commitments in other areas, so the rumour for us was that the actual marketing budget for Body Harvest was probably in the region of about £20,000 to £30,000 sterling, which was nothing in those days. It's not a lot now, but it is absolutely nothing. So the expectation for us was that it wouldn't get the great fanfare and release that it probably deserved. And right enough, it opened quite quietly, didn't sell particularly well, I don't think, and the rest is history, as they say.
Two decades later, Body Harvest is barely considered a cult classic. It didn't sell well, its controls are incredibly janky, and its open world design hasn't aged very well. It's a relic of early 3D gaming, a time capsule to a period when the industry was making a monumental shift into a new frontier of technology and design, and the growing pains of this transition are unmistakable. When you compare Body Harvest to Grand Theft Auto 3, the similarities are striking, but it's reductive to view Body Harvest alone as its principal influence. DMA Design had become a success because it wasn't afraid to experiment and give its developers freedom in the process. It's no surprise then that such a creative and innovative culture would eventually lead to one of the most influential video games of its generation.
Every single game that we were working on within DMA, we would always take what we've learned on the previous projects. We'd always try and build on what we thought was actually successful. The thing about open world, the thing about puzzle elements, story-based, talking to characters, narrative, going into buildings, searching all this stuff. jumping from vehicle to vehicle, you can already see that was already the basic bare bones of like being able to push GTA forward into that 3D realm as well. So, you know, with games like Body Harvest, with games like Silicon Valley, with other games, you know, every single game like Wild Metal Country and things, it was all a progression, which in the end led to GTA 3.